So today, as I record the images for
January 25th,
those elements in the space-time
January 20th, 2012,
travel
known professional
communication
Etta
coordinate
James
system
was an American
that
singer who performed in various genres,
refer
including
to
gospel, blues, jazz, R&B, rock and roll,
refer to
and
that
soul.
section
Starting her career in
from
1954,
181
she
to
gained fame with hits such as
225.
The Wallflower, At Last,
That
Tell Mama,
if you've been following
Something's
along, you
Got to
realize
Hold on
corresponds
Me,
to
I'd Rather Go Blind. She faced a
the
number
cycle of
personal
the
problems,
year
including heroin addiction,
that can be
severe
designated
physical
something
abuse,
like
and incarceration,
midsummer
before making a musical
to
comeback
late
in the
summer,
late 1980s with the album 7 Year Itch.
insofar as the system refers to the idea of
She
a
won
wheel
6
or
Grammy
cycle of
Awards
the
and
year.
17 Blues Music Awards.
And
She was inducted into the Rock and Roll
I
Hall
have
of Fame
promised
in
also
1993,
to
the Grammy Hall of
to
Fame
discuss the
in
relationship
1999,
to this
and the Blues
the
Hall of
system
Fame in
to
2001. She
life
also
stages,
received a
and there are
Lifetime Achievement Award in
numerous ways of
2003.
conceiving
Rolling
of
Stone magazine ranked
the
James
idea
number
of
22
life
on its list
stages,
of the 100 greatest
whether one
singers
is
of all time.
human or
She was also ranked
some
number
other
62
organic
on Rolling Stone's list of the 100
intelligent
greatest
entity.
artists of all time. Billboard's 2015 list of
And
the 35 greatest
or
R&B
even
artists of all time also
if one
included
conceives
James,
of
whose gutsy,
artificial
teacher-driven
intelligence
vocal
as
colorfully
an entity
interpreted
that
everything
learns,
from blues
one
and
could
early
also
soul to rock and roll,
metaphorize the
jazz
idea
and
of
gospel.
life and stages and
The Rock
terms
and
of
Roll
developmental
Hall of Fame
processes
called her
that
one of the
contribute
greatest
to
voices of her century and says she
the
is
evolving
forever the matriarch
complexity
of blues.
of such an intelligence.
Hawkins was
And
born on January 25th, 1938.
and
in
so
Los Angeles,
beginning with
California,
this idea
to Dorothy
that
Hawkins, who was
the
14
point
at the
0
time.
and 360
Although her
is
father has never been identified,
designates the
James
date
speculated that she was the daughter of pool
December
player Rudolph,
21st,
Minnesota
and
Fox Wander one, whom
and
she
marks
met
this
briefly in 1987. Her
planetary
mother was frequently
phenomenon
absent from
called
their
the
apartment
winter
West,
solstice, in which
conducting relationships with
we
various
experience
men,
the
and
shortest
James
day
lived
of the
with a
year,
series of foster
and therefore
parents,
the day
most
filled
notably
with
Sarge
the
and
least amount
Mama
of light.
Hill. James referred to her
There
mother
are a
as
couple of
the
ways
mystery lady. James received
approaching
her
where
first
one
professional
might
vocal training
begin,
at the age of
or there
5
were
from
perhaps
James
more
Earl
than one
Hines,
way,
musical director of
where
the Echoes
one
Evening
might
Choir at the
begin
St. Paul Baptist Church in South
on this
Central
wheel
Los Angeles. Hines
and
reviewed James
configure a
while she
point
was under
that
his tutelage. He often punched her in the chest while she sang to force her voice to come
that
from her
refers
guts.
to
She quickly became known for having an unusually strong voice for a child her age. Sarge, like
moment
the musical
of,
director for the choir, was also abusive. During drunken poker games at home, he would awake
of the
James in
beginning
the early morning hours and
one's
force her with
human
meetings to
life.
sing for his friends.
And
The drama
and
in
those
foster
are
mom
interesting
portion of
questions,
Sing
because
Under
those
These
questions
Humiliating
now are being
Circumstances caused her to have
decided by
difficulties with singing on demand throughout her career.
being decided by the
James
Supreme
frequently
Court
performed in
for all of
Nashville's
us,
R&B clubs on
based
the
on very
so-called
little
Children's
science
Circuit in the
and quite a
1940s,
lot of
50s,
ideology
and 60s.
that
In 1950,
pretends to
Mama died,
grow
and
out
James's
of
biological mother took her to the Fillmore district of San Francisco. Within a couple of
principles
years,
that
she
belong
began
to
listening
this
to doo-wop and was
domain
inspired
that we
to
refer
form a
to
girl
as
group, the Creolettes,
Christianity,
so named for the members'
but in
high school
fact
complexions.
belong to
At the age
really
of
belong
14,
to
she
rather
met musician
a
Johnny
long
Otis.
and cumbersome
Stories on
history
how they met
of
vary. In Otis's version, she came
Catholic
to his hotel
ideology
after one of his performances
that
in the city
has
and persuaded
almost
him to audition her.
nothing
Another
whatsoever
story
to
was
do
that
with
Otis spotted the Creolettes
anything
performing
that
at a Los Angeles nightclub and
belongs to
sought
what
for
we
them
refer to as the
record his
gospel
answer
that was
song
taught
to
by
Hank Ballard's Work
this
With
figure,
Me,
this
Annie.
historical figure,
Otis
Jesus
took the Creolettes
Christ,
under his wing and helped them sign
and
to
so this
Modern Records,
ideology
at which point they changed their name to
that's
Peaches.
being
At this
inscribed
time,
upon
Otis also gave James her stage name, transposing James Etta,
you know,
her
those
given first
regulations
name,
and
into
those
Etta James.
laws
In
that
1954, James recorded and
that
was
limit
credited as co-author
particularly
for
you
The
know,
Wallflower,
women's
the
ability
title
to
change to the
exist
aforementioned song, Work With Me,
in this
Annie,
society
which was
with
released in
any
early 1955.
autonomy and control
The original title of the
are
song was
now being
actually Roll With
configured
Me,
into
Henry, but it had been changed to avoid censorship at the time, role implying sexual activity. In February of 1955,
to a kind of myth
the song
of
reached #1 on the Hot Rhythm and Blues Tracks chart. Its success also gave the Peaches an opening spot on Little Richard's national tour. While James was on tour with Richard,
this
pop singer
idea
Georgia Gibbs recorded a
of
version of her
life
song
that
and released
and this
under
myth,
the
what it does
unaltered
is
title,
it supports
Dance With Me,
the
Henry.
regulation
It became a crossover hit,
and
reaching
control
#1 on the Billboard Hot 100
of
with
women's
Jane
activities
James.
and
After leaving the Peaches, James had another R&B
provides
good rockin' daddy, but struggled with follow-ups. When her contract with Modern came up for renewal in 1960,
provides the basis of
she
a
signed
series
a contract
of
with Jazz Records instead, with which she would go on to become one of the label's earliest stars. Around this time, she became involved in a relationship
misunderstandings
with the singer Bobby Bugle,
that
the founder of the doo-wop group
that are
the
utilized
Moonblues. Musician Bobby
as
Murray toured with
doctrinal
James for over
to
20
support
years. He
a
wrote
set
that James
of
had her first hit
authoritarian
single when she was
regulations
15 years old and went steady with being
and
a hit when
violations
she
of,
was
you know,
16.
basic
James believed
human
that
rights
King's hit
and
single, Sweet 16,
dignities.
was about
And
her. In early 1955,
and so you know, I don't want to get you know, too involved in all of that in constructing this 360 unit
She noted how impressed she was with the young singer's manners.
space-time travel
She also recalled how happy he
communication
made her
coordinate
many years later
system
when she found out that it was Presley
and
who had moved
how
her
we
close
would
friend Jackie Wilson from a
articulate
substandard convalescent
right
home to a more
the
appropriate
entrance into
facility and,
the
as
human
she
life
put it,
cycle
paid all the expenses.
in it
Presley
today,
died a year
but
later. Wilson went on to live for another 10 years
I'll
in the care
simplify
center
and
Presley
abstract
found for him.
what seems to me some
Duetting with
obvious
Harvey Fugal, James recorded for
ways of
Arca
organizing
Records, later renamed
the temporality of the
a label
system,
established by Chess.
and then
Her
I'll
first hit
you
singles
know,
with
I'll make a
Fugal were
choice
If I Can't Have You and Spoonful.
related to
Her
that
first
system.
solo hit was the
But as you'll
doo-wop
recall,
rhythm and
so
blues
the
song, All I Could Do Was Cry,
the top
which
of the
was a
circle,
#2
which
R&B
represents the
hit.
direction north,
Chess
is also
Records co-founder
identified
Leonard
as
Chess envisioned James as a classic ballad
as
stylist
midwinter,
who had potential to cross
and
over
that
to
point,
the pop charts, and soon surrounded the singer with
0360
violins and other string
is
instruments.
designated
The
as
first string-laden ballad James recorded was
December
My Dearest
21st.
Darling in May 1960,
And that's
which peaked in the
approximately,
top
you know,
5 of the
midwinter,
R&B
but it's
chart.
exactly
James sang
the
background
point of
vocals for her label mate
the
Chuck
winter
Berry on
solstice.
his
So
Back
being
in
the
USA, her
point
debut album,
in the
At
year
Last,
that represents
was released in late 1960
the least
and was
amount of
noted
light,
for its
one
varied
could
selection of music,
arguably,
from jazz standards to blues
if
to
one
doo-wop and
utilizes the
rhythm and
metaphor
blues,
of
R&B.
light as
The album
enlightenment, and
included
enlightenment
the
as a
future
certain
classics,
kind
I
of
Just Want to
experience,
Make Love
right,
to
as
You
it is
and
in
A Sunday
William
Kind
Blake,
of Love.
in which the passage through these
James
what I
released
would
what
call,
was to
you know,
become her
gates or
signature song,
bars
At Last,
of
a Glenn
vision,
Miller tune,
right,
which
afford
reached #2 on the R&B chart
the
and
subject that moves
47 on the
through
Billboard
this
Hot 100.
the phenomenon
Though
of
the
this
record
world,
was not as successful as expected,
particularly the
rendition has
visionary,
become
but
the
any
best-known version of
soul
the song.
that passes through
James followed
this
with Trust in Me, which
domain
also
of experience,
includes
you know,
string
that we refer
instruments.
to as, you know,
Later
human
the
life.
same year, 1960,
For Blake,
James released a second studio album,
the passage
The
through
Second
these
Time
gates and the
Around.
ability
The
to
album took the
you know,
same
overcome
direction
one's
as her
fear
first, covering jazz
and
and
trepidation
pop standards
and
with strings on many of the songs. It
and
produced
perhaps,
2 hit singles, Fool
you know,
That
other
I Am
obstacles
and Don't Cry
that
Baby. James started adding gospel elements in her
that
music the following year, releasing
the attachment to the attachment to safety and familiarity and comfort, you know, inspire, you know, what he refers to in one poem as the retreat, you know, back into the veil of horror. And
in 1963, she
you know,
had
of
another
course,
major
referring
hit
to
with
Sal,
Pushover and released
but
her live album and James Rocks
these
the
gates
House, recorded at the New Era Club
like,
in
or these
Nashville,
bars
Tennessee.
that one has
After a couple of
to pass
years of minor hits,
through to
James's
be
career
granted
started to
these
suffer
visions
after 1965. After a period
are
of isolation,
conceived of
she
as
returned to
obstacles,
recording in
and therefore in a
1967 and
way,
emerged with
you know,
North R&B
not
honors
entirely
rights to her recording at the legendary Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals,
not entirely
Alabama.
dissimilar to
These sessions yielded her a
what one
comeback
could
hit,
imagine
Tell
as
Mama, Co-written by Clarence Carter, which reached number 10 on the R&B
the
chart,
conceptualization
and
of stages of
number 23
development in which
worldwide. An
a
album of the same name was
developmental
also released
stage
that year and
is
included
perceived
No
as
Notice
a struggle
Weddings,
or a
Security.
challenge, right?
The
That
B-side
one
of Tell Mama
that one
was
needs
I'd
to
Rather Go
confront and
Blind,
have the courage
which became a blues classic
to
and has
engage
been
and
recorded by many other
overcome
artists.
whatever obstacles
In
exist
her
at that stage
autobiography,
in order
Rage
to
Survive,
fully
she wrote
develop
that she heard
within
the
that
song
stage.
outlined by her friend
So,
Winston Fury,
if we think of the
prison.
human,
According
life
to
cycle
her
as
account,
beginning
she wrote
in
the
some
rest
kind of
of the
state
song with Jordan, but for tax
being
reasons
altricial
gave
or
her songwriting credit to her partner at the
altriciarity, I'm
time,
not sure
Billy
how one
Foster.
would configure that
Following this success, James became
particular
an
adjective
in-demand
as a
concert
noun,
performer,
but
though
the
she never again
altricial
reached the heyday
nature
early to
of the
mid-
child, one could
1960s
imagine
success.
that metaphorically
Her
as
records continued to
the
chart in
the
R&B
absence
Top
of
40 in the
light,
early
right? The absence of
1970s,
knowledge,
with
the
singles such as Losers Weepers,
in many cultures,
and I Found
the
a
soul
Love,
before entering the world
1972.
is
Though James
forgets,
continued to
what it
record
had
for
learned
Gist,
in
she
the
was
course of its
devastated by the
journey
death
through
of record
all of
executive
these
Leonard
other
Just in
lives that it has led. And in
1969.
fact,
James ventured into rock
in-
and
in,
funk
uh,
with the release of her self-titled album
in Greek mythology,
1973, with production from the
that
famed rock
forgetting,
producer Gabriel Metzler, who had
is,
worked with Steppenwolf and Janis Joplin.
is one of the
Joplin had admired James and had covered Tell Mama in concert. James' 1973
preconditions,
album
right,
exhibited
of
a
entrance
mixture of
into
musical
this world.
styles,
And there's a
was
similar
nominated for a Grammy
in
Award.
William Blake.
The
There's a
album did
similar
not produce
idea,
any major hits,
and
however,
and
neither did
the
the follow-up album,
the function
Come a Little
of
Closer,
passing
in
through these gates of vision
1974,
is to
like
recover,
73
what
James
has been
before it.
forgotten.
The album was also
And
critically acclaimed. In 1975,
that's certainly there,
opened
and
for comedian
we
Richard
mentioned
Pryor at the
Blake's
Sugar
reading
Theater
habits,
in
and
Los Angeles.
Porphyry, the
James
Platonist, who
continued to
I
record
believe
for
I
Gist,
had
now
identified
owned
as
by All Platinum Records,
a Latinist, who of
releasing
course is
one
not a
more album in
Latinist,
1976, Etta is Better Than
but a
Your
Greek
Mom. Her
scholar
1978 album Deep in the Night,
Greek
produced
ideas,
by Jerry Wexler
classical
for
Greek
Warner
ideas,
Brothers,
and
incorporated more rock-based music.
and so
that same year, James
that
was
relationship
opening
that
up
often
for the
goes
Rolling Stones and performing
overlooked
on
in
Jazz
reading
Festival.
Blake is
Following this
is
brief
actually
success,
a
however,
pretty
she left
profound
Gist Records and
part
did not record
of
for
his
another
compass,
10
and it's
years
also
while she
part of
struggled
the
with
way
drug
that
addiction and alcoholism.
the divisions
James
that
continued
he
to
makes of the
perform on
world,
occasion
that
in
we've
the
talked
early
about as
1980s,
being,
including 2 guest appearances at Grateful Dead
if
concerts
not,
in December 1982, and was a guest on John
dialectical,
Mayall's Blues Breakers 1982 reunion show in New Jersey.
these
In
sets
1984,
of
she contacted David Walper and asked to perform in the opening ceremony
active,
of the
right,
1984
contrastive
Summer Olympics,
features,
at which she
innocence,
sang When the Saints Go
experience
Marching In.
that
In 1987,
that are
she
divided
performed
in various
rock and roll
ways,
music
and
with Chuck Berry in the documentary film Hail.
and that also
Rock and
relate
roll.
to
In
the turning of
1989,
a
she
kind
signed
of
with Island Records,
wheel
then released the albums
of
7 Year
knowledge,
Itch
and
Stick
you
It to
could
My
say,
Guns,
gnosis,
both of which were
might
produced by
even be a
Barry
better word.
Beckett and recorded at famous studios. Also,
And this idea of
James
this
was
wheel,
filmed
and
in
whether
the
it's a
concert at the
fourfold
Wiltern
division
Theater
or
in Los
a eightfold
Angeles with
division,
Joe
or
Walsh and
some
Albert
other
Collins for the
kind
film
of
Jazz
division,
Visions, Jump the Blues Away.
is
Many of the backing
the division
musicians were
itself
top-flight players from Los Angeles. Rick Roses,
is not
Michael
constructed
Hughes,
in this
drums,
way that
Ed Sanford, Hammond
it's
Friorgan,
often treated as
Noble,
in
piano, and Josh Slair, James
instructionalist
Wolfine, guitar
readings,
player.
right,
James participated
of
with
these
the rap
terms,
singer
because
Jeff on the song Dropping
the
Rhymes on
contrastive
Drums,
features are
which
there
mixed
to
James's
turn
jazz
or
vocals
move
with
the wheel,
hip-hop.
right?
In 1992, she recorded the album
Fear
The
versus
Right
courage
Time,
is there
produced
to
by Jerry
encourage
Wexler for Elektra
or
Records.
to
She was
motivate, or
inducted into the Rock and
I don't
Roll Hall
know,
of Fame
create the
in
design of
1993.
movement
James
and
signed
the
with
possibility
Private Music
of
Records in 1993
encountering
and recorded
this
the Billie
particular
Holiday
gate of
tribute
vision
album,
and
Mystery Lady, Songs of Billie Holiday. The album set a trend of incorporating
either
more
passing
jazz
through
elements in
or failing
James'
to pass
music.
through it. But the
album won
encounter
James her first
is
Grammy Award
dynamic,
for Best
right,
Jazz
rather
Vocal
than
Performance,
static or
Female,
stationary,
in
the way it's often seen
1994.
in
In 1995,
non-developmental
her autobiography,
usages
The Rage to Survive,
usages
co-written with David Ritz,
of structural
was published. Also in
philosophy and
1995,
structural formalist thinking. And I don't know, I guess I was thinking all about that because in ascribing a notion of life development to the 360 degrees, I considered, some of the ways that Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, might be read as a kind of parallel, to Blake's gates and encounters with these types of
music, which released the blues album Matriarch of the Blues in
domains of vision, that the psychological and visionary subject, either passes through and into and occupies or retreats from and fails to integrate oneself into. And so
her final album for
thinking about that and where to locate the inception point of these stages on this particular compass led me to a number of different conceptions, and the first one has to do with light. So if we're thinking about these stages as the inception of light, and of course, Blake belonged to that period, late part of that period, and he was certainly unusual, representation of it, but belonged to that period of enlightenment, and we often associate him with the Romantics and being a romantic. But there's a curious way in which William Blake is both a precursor to Romanticism and a sort of critical.
After Date of Death. She also often performed at free summer arts festivals throughout the United States. In 2008, James was portrayed by
critical
Knowles in the film Cadillac Records, a fictional account of Chess Records, James's label for 18 years, about how label founder and producer Leonard Chess helped the careers of James and others. The film included At Last,
I don't want to say revisionist,
by Beyonce.
but
James would go on to publicly criticize Beyonce, who was invited to perform the song
a critical evolution of the ideas of the Enlightenment,
from personal hurt over not having
or
been
a
to the
critical variant
It was later
of
reported that Alzheimer's disease
a lot of the
drug-induced dementia have contributed to her
what we see as those elements which define a kind of stability among thinkers that we recognize as belonging to the Enlightenment. And one could say that
she received the Soul Blues Female Artist of the Year award from the Blues
Blake
Foundation,
exceeds
the ninth time she won that award.
that
She
stability,
carried on touring, but by
and
2010 had to
in many
cancel
many
concerts
ways,
because
and
of
for
her
many
gradually
reasons.
failing health. By
But
this time, she was suffering from
but
dementia
it's still
and
one of
leukemia. In
the
November
circles, or
2011,
if we were to draw
James released her
compasses and
final
include
album,
and exclude
The
things
Dreamer,
from the
which was
circles drawn by
critically
those
acclaimed upon its
compasses in the
release.
manner
She
of
announced that this would be her final album. James' enduring relevance was affirmed in 2011.
Venn
when the late
diagrams.
Swedish DJ Avicii achieved
Blake would still
substantial
belong
chart
in
success with the
some
song
interesting
Levels,
ways to
which samples her 1962
that configuration
song, Something's
of
Got
that
a Hole in Me.
conceptualization of
The same sample
Enlightenment
was
thought.
used by the East Coast rapper
And,
Florida in his 2011
And if light
single,
is the
Good Feeling.
primary
Both artists issued
metaphor
statements of
for
condolence
understanding
upon
of
James's death. James' original
knowledge,
classic
then
music again charted after these
then it would
21st
make
century
great sense
interpretations.
in a certain
James
way
was
to
among
begin
hundreds of artists whose material
to
was
begin the life
destroyed in the
stages
2008 Universal Fire.
at 0 in 1 perhaps, the unit 1, and recognizing that
at the beginning of her recording career in the mid-1950s, James was
that
marketed
December
as an R&B and doo-wop
22nd,
singer.
is
After
a
signing
day
with
that
Jet
has,
Records in
more
1960,
light
James broke
than
through as a traditional
December
pop-style singer,
21st
covering
because
jazz and pop music standards on her debut
of the
album,
movement
At Last.
of
James's
Earth
voice deepened in
in
Correspondence,
its
moving her musical
revolutions
style in her
around,
later years into
around
the
the
genres
sun,
of soul and
and
jazz. James
at least
was
in
once
our
considered one of the
northern
most overlooked
compass,
blues
so
and
I'm
R&B
already
musicians in the
inscribing
music
Blake
history of the
within
United States. It was not
my
until the early
own
1990s
egocentric
when she began receiving major
American,
industry awards from the Grammys and
U.S.
the Blues Foundation
as
that
well
she
as
received wide recognition.
as
In more recent
European
years,
hemisphere,
she has been
right?
hailed
And
as
and
a
that's
pioneer
important to
who helped
understand
bridge the
that this
gap
is
between rhythm and blues and
this
rock
is
and
not
roll, and thereby
so
contributed
already we are
significantly to American
relativizing
musical
our
history.
understanding of this
James
compass,
has
and
influenced a
so
wide
someone
variety of
lived in
musicians,
Australia
including,
would
notably, Diana Ross, Christina Aguilera,
is one using the
Janis
same
Joplin,
map and compass,
Brandy,
and
Bonnie Raitt,
we can
Shirley
certainly make
Copeland,
adjustments,
Beth Hart, and Hayley
but
Williams of
provisionally
Madrigal,
and for
as
the
well as
sake of
British artists,
clarity
Rolling
and
Stones, L.T. Brooks,
synchronicity,
Faith,
we often
Joss
make
Stone,
these
Rita Ora, Amy Winehouse,
determinations
and
to mark
Adele,
a
and
fixed
Bell
point,
singer
right,
Danny Klein.
as inception,
In
even
particular,
though it
her
really
song,
is
Something's
relative,
Got Hold on Me,
and certainly
has been
the
recognized
seasonal
in many ways.
designations
Brussels music
are
act
relative.
Al Condios covered the song on their
For thousands of
1990
years, they
album
may
Night
not have
Owls.
been perceived
Another
as such
version,
for certain
performed
of
by
us,
Christina Aguilera,
that
was in the
never
2010
exceeded the
film
boundaries
Burlesque. Pretty
of
White
those
sampled
hemispheres,
the
right,
song in
and that
Find Me
relationship
Movie,
to light that
followed
those
by
hemispheres
Avicii's
establish,
dance
but
hit
there
Levels,
certainly
and
are
again in
relative.
Flo Rida's single Good Feeling. James knew Malcolm X and was a
But that
member
would
of
be,
the Nation of Islam for around 10
a
years,
potential way of
taking
doing
the name
it if
James
we
out of
think
X.
of it as a
James
wheel
was married to
of
artist
light.
Mills from
And
1969 until her death in 2012.
and there's another way, of course, of doing
James
it,
had two
and
sons,
that
Dr.
way
James and
belongs
Etta
to
James, born to
the
different
idea
fathers.
of spring
Both were
and life
musicians
beginning in
eventually
spring, and
performed
it
professionally
often
with their
is
mother.
and does,
Tonto
right?
played drums at Montreux in 1993, and Sanetto played
not
bass
just
guitar
rabbits,
circa
but
2003,
many birds
among other
are born in
performances and
spring,
tours.
and
By the mid-1960s, James
and
was
the reason
addicted to
that
heroin.
so much
She
birth
bounced
occurs in
checks,
spring and not
forged
winter is
prescriptions,
because
and
of
stole
the
from her friends to
ultra-shell
finance
nature
her
of
addiction. James was arrested in
the
1966 for writing bad checks.
of the
She
young
was
animal
placed on probation in order to pay a $500
that is cared for,
fine.
by
In
its parents,
1969,
particularly
she spent 10 days in jail
the
for
mother,
violating probation. James encountered
and it's
a string
easier
of
to
legal
care for
problems during the early 1970s due to
this
her heroin
child
addiction.
in the
She was
spring than it would be
continuously in and out of
the
rehabilitation
cold,
centers,
harsh
including the
winter.
Tarzana treatment
And
centers in Los
and so,
Angeles, California. Her husband, Artis Mills, accepted responsibility
that
when they were
idea,
both arrested for heroin possession and served
almost
a 10-year
seems
prison
less of a
sentence.
metaphor
He
to
was
me than
released
the
from
idea
prison in 1981.
of light
In
and knowledge,
1973,
even though we're
James was
talking
arrested for
about
possession of heroin. In
knowledge
1974,
when we talk about
James was
stages of
sentenced to drug
development.
treatment instead of serving
So I
time
thought that
in
I would
prison.
begin.
During this period, she became addicted to methadone and would mix
there is
her
this
doses with
choice.
heroin.
The
She was
the
in
top of the
Tarzana
wheel,
Psychiatric Hospital
0
for 17
representing
months, starting at the
origin,
age of
or
36, and
we
went
could say
through a great
45
struggle
degrees,
to
or
start
perhaps
the treatment.
46 degrees,
In her
representing
1995 autobiography, Rage to
the
Survive,
onset of
she
spring.
said that the time she
And
spent in the hospital
I think
changed her
I
life.
would like to
After
choose.
leaving treatment, however, her substance abuse
I would
continued,
choose
particularly after she
spring
developed a relationship
as
with
the
a man
origin
who was
point
also using
of,
drugs. In 2010,
of
James
human life
received
and
treatment for a
human
dependency
development,
on
and therefore it
painkillers.
begins at
James was
birth. We would say
hospitalized
is
in
perhaps
January 2010
birth and
to
death.
treat an
Perhaps
infection
mark
caused by an RSA,
45
a
on the compass, so
bacterium-resistant to
the
many
number 45
antibiotics.
in space-time travel
During her
communication coordinates,
hospitalization,
and
her
46
son Anto revealed
begins
to the public that she had
life
been
proper.
previously
And
diagnosed with Alzheimer's
and so if we
disease in
inscribe that,
2008. James was diagnosed with
and we
leukemia
could
in
designate it
2011.
because I like
The illness became
Erik
terminal,
Erikson's stages
and
of
her husband,
psychosocial
Artis
development
Mills, was appointed sole conservator
for
of
this
James'
purpose,
estate
not
to
only
oversee
because
her medical care.
there
She
are
died
8
on
stages,
January 20th,
and those 8 stages are pretty easy to map within, each segment of the 45 degrees of the compass. But also because, as I mentioned before, there's this notion of an encounter, right? Like struggle or adjustment, maladjustment is seen as overcoming in certain way what might be an obstacle in this life stage, and the obstacle is created both by the environment in which the individual is growing and learning, and by the resources that psychological subject has to overcome whatever obstacles those are. And so in that way, it's very much like the way that Blake articulates human experience, and also these binary oppositions that Erikson formulates. I'm not a structuralist, but the binary oppositions are very easy to negotiate, right? And provisionally, they're in this instance they're provisionally useful, and also easy to challenge in certain ways, or to examine and interrogate in terms of actual life stories and phenomena. For example, yesterday we began, or I didn't really begin anything, but yesterday I put up at the top of the page a reference to Etta James and the life of Etta James, and I hinted at a metaphorical, relationship between the content of one of her most famous songs, "At Last," and her life story, particularly her early childhood life story, that was in ways that exceed most of our stories, filled with obstacles and extreme, conditions that even a child of resourceful resilience and inner strength would have a very difficult time surviving. And so the conditions under which her survival and her success, the conditions under which her survival and success were maintained, threatened, and
since 1989, continuously from 1999 to 2007. Her albums Life, Love, and the Blues, 1999, Burning Down the House, 2003, and Let's Roll, 2004, were awarded Soul Blues Album of the Year, and in 2001, she was inducted into the Blues Hall of Fame.
Really exceeded in a certain way
story by David Ritz with Etta James. American
the
Life of Etta James by
the constraints that Erikson's psychosocial development model presents to us, and
3 live albums and 12 compilations,
and because of that, it occurred to me that in constructing this wheel, this 360 degree dynamic system of communication, and formulating it as, in part, a life stages or developmental model, and doing so in relationship to these 8 45-degree sections of the compass, right?
With her vocal group, the Peaches, singing background vocals,
that figures within this system with real life stories and histories, could be utilized to investigate and challenge the say the fidelity of Erikson's model, and that could constitute a discourse, in and of itself. And so I really have time in this discussion. Perhaps we'll say more in some other discussion, but I'll conclude with just a list of there's a chart in the Wikipedia page on Erikson, and it's all right. None of the discussions online are really very good.
It was followed the second time
I don't see that the Wikipedia page is any worse than many of the psychological journal publications that are available on Erikson. But one of the things that the Wikipedia page does do that's kind of useful is that it lays out this chart and of these stages, of these 8 stages, and it assigns
James returned with her first studio album in 9 years in 1989 titled
under these columns, that have designators, and these designators, are referred to as, well, first of all, the first designator is it gives you the approximate age in which this stage occurs, and then the designators tell you more about each one of these stages in terms of the following. So the first column designation is virtues. The second one is psychosocial crisis. That's the obstacle or the gate, right, that one has to get through. Significant relationships. So like who's responsible? Like in other words, like if you were thinking about it in terms of Blake, like who's calling, and who should I say is calling from Leonard Cohen, right? And then the existential question, right? So these would be the question, like if you're using this as a communication device, these are the questions that we're talking about. This is the discourse. This is, as Michael Sprinkler would say, what is the subject, right? And then the events, which around which, and this last section, the events, from my taste, it becomes a little too Freudian and is inscribed back upon, the body of the child as developing in relationship to the Oedipal crisis. But let's not worry about that for the time being, as I merely make my way through the chart and articulate them. So the rows within this chart are designations of those years, right, and descriptions, names of the years in which these stages take place. So there are 8 rows, and then within those 8 rows, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns that give you these features for the 8 stages. All right, so I'll go ahead and read them, as I hinted that I would do, and if we need more discussion of Erikson, then we'll probably need to leave the Wikipedia site, but I won't have time for that today. So infancy is described as that period under 1 year. Its virtue is hope. Its psychosocial crisis is trust versus mistrust. Its significant relationship is with the mother. Its existential question is, can I trust the world? And its events, as I said, which this last descriptor is the least interesting to me, is feeding and abandonment. The next is toddlerhood, which is 1 to 2 years. Its virtue is will. Its psychosocial crisis is autonomy versus shame, doubt. Its significant relationship is parents. So, that's interesting because, what does that mean in terms of a mother? Well, I mean, I wonder, if Erikson had imagined that mother is really like the physical domain and parents is the abstract domain. So, right? So, So if one had a nanny or a wet nurse, that would designate mother, but then parents is mother proper. Now, if you grow up, again, parents is pluralized, but many of us grew up without two parents, and or many individuals are raised by their grandparents or in foster care. So what does designate the distinction between mother and parents? And certainly in the case of Etta James, who I mentioned earlier, as developing through these very extreme life conditions, not only was the father absent and unknown of this figure, like unknown as in X, in her early child development, but the parameters for motherhood in any reasonably conceptual way were very indeterminate, and parenting in the strict sense, so almost entirely absent. So, and even we haven't gotten there yet, but the third figure in these significant relationships is designated here as family. Well, the distinctions between mother, parents, and family get rather messy in real life, under real life conditions, right? So we have to take all that into account when we put this into the discourse of our wheel, right? Okay, so anyway, going back, significant relationship in the first instance is mother, existential question in the first instance is can I trust the world, events in the first instance is feeding and abandonment, and then in the second, as we began, and I'll just begin again, toddlerhood 1 to 2 years, virtues, will, psychosocial crisis, autonomy versus shame, doubt, significant relationship, which as we're doing, as I have been doing, we're problematizing, parents, existential question, is it okay to be me, events, toilet training, and clothing oneself. Early childhood designated by the period of 3 to 6 years, virtues, purpose, psychosocial crisis, initiative versus guilt, significant relationship, family, existential question, is it okay for me to do, move, and act, events, exploring, using tools, or making art, middle childhood, 7 to 10 years, virtues, competence, psychosocial crisis, industry versus inferiority, significant relationship, neighbors, school, existential question, can I make it in the world of people and things, events, school, and sports, adolescence, 11 to 19 years. I should have been actually, identifying these with each of the 45 segmented 8 segments in the chart. But infancy would begin with 46 to 90. Toddlerhood would begin with 91 to 135. Early childhood would begin with 136 to 180, etc., etc., etc. So let's go back up to middle childhood. Middle childhood, the virtues are competence, psychosocial crisis, industry versus inferiority, significant relationship, neighbors, interesting, school, existential question, can I make it in the world of people and things? Just can I make it is very colloquial and belongs to a certain zeitgeist, but I kind of like that. It sounds very 70s. Can I make it in the world of people and things? All right, so events, school and sports, adolescence, 11 to 19 years, virtues, fidelity, psychosocial crisis, identity versus role confusion. Okay, this is really problematic now, right? Particularly in terms of gender and the way that our society is, putting a lot of authoritarian and and reactionary restriction and oppression and designating, with all of its refined tools of normativity and psychosocial binary toolboxing to deny individuals their own destiny and their own self-understanding, and in addition to the violence that's being done to women, in the obliteration of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court, the rights of individuals who are gay, who are lesbian, who are transsexual, who identify either gender or sexuality in non-binary ways, are being, not only threatened with elimination of rights and abilities of self-determination, but being physically threatened in the world, and in terms of the right to exist and to be and to act on one's own behalf, and so when we see these figures and a social crisis being identified as identity versus role confusion, we have to realize that in a conscious expanding project, that presumably that we wish to be engaged in here, that these terms have to be recognized as potentially in the service of a state that denies us our rights to be free and to pass through such gates, right, of vision and self-understanding as we want them to be recognized in our own development and visionary self-discovery, right? So we need to be aware of that when we encounter these terms, all right? So adolescence, 11 to 19 years, virtues, fidelity, psychosocial crisis, identity versus role confusion, however we define that, and we need to define it in a more visionary and imaginative way, I'm most sure than Erikson does himself. Significant relationship, peers, role models, existential questions, who am I? Who can I be? I assume that means, both who can I be and who can I become. Events, social relationships. We can get more into that, but that has to do with a lot of different spheres of interactive influence. Early adulthood, 20 to 44 years, virtues, love, psychosocial crisis, intimacy versus isolation, significant relationships, friends and partners, existential question, can I love, events, romantic relationships, middle adulthood, 45 to 64 years, virtues, care. It's interesting that care falls in that this care, and it's interesting because you have above care you have love, but if you look at it from the point of view of Erik Fromm, right, love is essentially care is essentially one of the elements that he defines as belonging to this configuration or constellation that is composed of many facets, including understanding, care, and all of those. But largely, love and care are almost synonymous in Fromm, and it's interesting in this chart that demonstrates that for Erikson these are more clearly distinct. And when Erikson's talking about love, he's talking about romantic relationships. But when Fromm is talking about love, he's talking about a relationship with entities that one provides for in this experiential domain of empathy and interaction, right? So it's probably important to keep that in mind. Middle adulthood, 45 to 64 years, care, psychosocial crisis, generativity versus stagnation, significant relationship, household, workmates, existential question, can I make my life count? Interesting, this idea, this word count is used here. Events, work, parenthood. It's interesting that work comes so late in Erik, from 45 to 64 years. And parenthood too, that seems very, I wonder if I need to re-examine this chart, because 45 years old to begin this stage of parenthood is really interesting. It's generally around 45 years, I imagine, that the parents leave home. So already, like, are we in this realm of metaphor then? Because early adulthood from 20 to 44 years would really seem to be that place in which one experiences parenthood. In any case, this is what the chart is giving us. And if I had more time, I might be able to address it in more detail, but I really don't. We're at almost 46 minutes already. A bit long for this process. Late adulthood is the eighth stage, and then we'll end there. 65 and above. The virtues are wisdom, the psychosocial crisis, ego, integrity versus despair, significant relationship, humankind, where one finds one's place in the universe, I suppose, if we wanted to expand upon that. Existential question, is it okay to have been me? Well, that's really formulated awkwardly, but I sort of get it. It's looking back, retrospective view of one's life, right? It's like one is writing one's memoirs at this stage, I suppose, yeah, and then the events are reflections on life, and many of us, begin this stage much earlier, and certainly a lot of what I put up on YouTube has to do with memoirs and recollections and reflections on life, and I'm not yet literally at this late adulthood stage of 35 and above, as I'm about to have my 58th, just about really on the edge of having my 58th birthday, but certainly in my activities, and perhaps I began early because of COVID, but certainly a lot of these activities have to do with this and the kind of looking back, although certainly there's a lot of teaching involved and pedagogy involved in what I do as well. In any case, this last section, reflection on life, would designate that area, whatever it is. 360, minus 45 is what, 300. So 300. Also in 1995. She recorded the album Time After Time. What? 316 to 360. It's a little difficult for me to do the subtraction there, but something like that, and we can go back and discuss these 8 segments in a lot more detail later. With the release of Life, Love, and the Blues, James had added as backing musicians her own sons, Dodo and Sameno, on drums and bass, respectively.